On a lonely stretch of road, far from any town, there stood an old, forgotten house. Its walls were peeling, and its windows were broken, but there was something about it that called out to people. A pull that no one could explain. People said it was cursed, that those who entered never came back the same or never came back at all. The air around the house always seemed colder, even in the heat of summer. The wind would howl through the cracks in the walls, creating a low, eerie moan that sent chills down the spine of anyone passing by. But the house had been quiet for years now, sitting like a grave marker of something terrible, something ancient. And no one dared to get close until tonight. Sarah's car rattled down the empty road, headlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground like a ghostly mist. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. 11:47 p.m. She should have been home hours ago, but her boss had made her stay late, again. The road was quiet, too quiet. She turned on the radio to fill the silence, but only static came through. Annoyed, she switched it off and focused on the road ahead. As she drove, her mind wandered to her cozy apartment waiting for her just a few miles away. The thought of a warm shower and crawling into bed made her push the gas pedal a little harder. But as she rounded a curve, her car suddenly sputtered and jerked. The engine light flashed on, and the car slowed to a stop. Sarah groaned, smacking the steering wheel. "Come on. Not now." She pulled her phone from her bag, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Typical. She was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest gas station, and her car had chosen this exact moment to break down. She slammed the door shut as she got out, the cool night air biting at her skin. She popped the hood and stared at the engine as if it would magically fix itself. "Great, just great," she muttered to herself. That's when she saw at the old house, just beyond the road, barely visible through the fog. It was only 100 feet away, hidden behind overgrown trees and vines that twisted around the structure like snakes. She had heard stories about it when she was a kid. Everyone called it the Morton House, but they also called it the house that hungers. Some said the place was alive, feeding off the fear and misfortune of anyone who entered. Sarah's breath quickened. She knew she shouldn't go near it. Every instinct screamed at her to stay away. But there was nowhere else to go, and she needed help. Maybe, just maybe, someone lived there. An old hermit or a recluse. Or perhaps there was a landline phone she could use to call a tow truck. She took a deep breath and started walking toward the house. As she got closer, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest sound of whispers. Her footsteps crunched on the gravel, each step growing heavier as if the air itself was thickening. The door to the house creaked open on its own, revealing a dark hallway inside. Sarah hesitated at the threshold. The darkness within the house felt alive, almost like it was watching her, waiting for her to step inside. She glanced back at her broken car, swallowed hard, and crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind her. The house's interior was suffocatingly still. Dust coated every surface, and the air was stale with the scent of rot and decay. She could hear the faint drip of water somewhere deep in the house, like a slow, steady heartbeat. The floor creaked under her weight, and the walls seemed to lean in ever so slightly, as if the house was closing around her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Just the steady drip of water and the creak of the old house settling around her. She walked further in, past an old wooden staircase and into what looked like a sitting room. The furniture was covered in tattered sheets, and a large mirror hung crooked on the wall, reflecting nothing but shadows. Sarah walked to the center of the room, her eyes scanning for any sign of life. But the house felt empty, abandoned. She should turn back. She should leave. But something kept her there, a strange curiosity pulling her deeper into the house. Then she heard it. A soft, barely audible laugh, like a child giggling in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, scanning the room for the source of the sound, but there was nothing, no one. Just the dusty furniture and the darkness pressing in from all sides. She swallowed hard and stepped toward the hallway, her feet dragging on the old, creaky floorboards. The further she walked, the darker it got. The house seemed to stretch out before her, the hallway growing longer, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. And then she saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall. It was small, like a child, its face obscured by shadows. But she could feel its eyes on her, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Hello," she whispered again, her voice barely more than a breath. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for her to make the next move. A cold sweat broke out on Sarah's forehead. Her hands trembled, and her breath quickened. Every instinct told her to run, to get out of the house as fast as she could. But her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, staring at the figure at the end of the hall. And then, in a blink, it was gone. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward into the sitting room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around wildly. The house was silent again, the air heavy with tension. She had to get out of there. She turned back toward the front door, but the hallway she had come down was gone, replaced by another long, twisting corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. Panic set in. The house was changing around her, shifting and warping like it was alive, like it was toying with her. She started to run, her feet pounding on the floor as she dashed down the hall, turning corner after corner, trying to find a way out. But every door she opened led to another hallway, another room filled with darkness and shadows. The house was a maze, and she was trapped inside it, running in circles. Then, suddenly, she was back in the sitting room. She stumbled to a stop, panting for breath. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was she losing her mind? Had she been running in circles, or was the house truly shifting around her? She didn't have time to dwell on it. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind her. She whipped around, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind her. Sarah spun around, but the room was empty. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, watching her with hollow, black eyes. It was tall and thin, its body twisted and unnatural, like something that didn't belong in this world. It stepped toward her, and Sarah screamed, backing away until she hit the wall. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes locked on her as it reached out with long, bony fingers. "No, please," Sarah whimpered, her voice trembling with fear. But the figure didn't stop. It moved closer and closer until it was inches away from her. She could feel the cold radiating off its body, could smell the stench of decay that clung to it like a cloud. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Stay." Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, trapped by the figure's gaze. The figure reached out and touched her cheek with one cold, bony finger. Sarah gasped, the touch sending a shock of cold through her body. The figure smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that showed too many teeth. "You belong to the house now," it whispered. And then everything went black. When Sarah woke up, she was lying on the floor of the sitting room, the figure gone. But the house felt different now. The air was heavier, thicker, and the shadows seemed to cling to her, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She tried to stand, but her legs were weak, and her body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She crawled toward the door, her fingers scraping against the rough wood of the floor. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. The house had her now. It had taken her, just like it had taken so many others before her. And as she lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, she could hear the whispers again, growing louder and louder until they were all she could hear. Stay. 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 The house was hungry. And Sarah was its next meal.